Tomorrow is the day of the yearly election of the well-doer. Tomorrow we shall again hand over to our well-doer the keys to the impregnable fortress of our happiness. Certainly this in no way resembles the disorderly, unorganized election days of the ancients, on which, it seems so funny, they did not even know in advance the results of the election. To build a state on some non-discountable contingencies, to build blindly, what could be more nonsensical? Well, this is uncomfortable. Go away. Today we're talking about We by Evgeniy Zamyatin, the first dystopia of the 20th century that in some shape or form influenced all other notable dystopias of that age, notably Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, 1984 by George Orwell, and Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. Yes, it also annoys me that my copy of Fahrenheit 451 is not the same edition as the rest of them, but what can you do? And it also has the least in common with the other three, so it's a little bit of foreshadowing here. In this video, I'm not going to focus too much on the author biography, not necessarily because it doesn't have anything to do with the story, it does, but it's not necessarily the angle that I want to take here, so I'm going to bring up the relevant points as we go. First, let's recap the plot to We before we really get into it, but I'm also assuming that you know the relevant plot points from Brave New World, 1984, and Fahrenheit 451, so spoiler warning for all four of these books. The book is structured as diary entries or records by a mathematician who lives in a distant future. In this distant future, after a 200-year war, only a small portion of the world's population survived, and they now live under a green dome where no animals or birds or plants really exist. They all live in the same glass houses, wear the same clothes, shave their heads, they march in unison, they even chew in unison, their lives are regulated by the hour. People no longer have names replaced by numbers, consonants for males and vowels for females. Sex is free for all. You can sign up for any number, get a pink ticket, and at a set hour you can close the blinds and have sex. Families no longer exist, only the best specimen are allowed to procreate, but they also don't get to keep their children. Children are raised collectively in so-called factories. Our protagonist, D503, is part of the team who's building an Integral, a spaceship that is designed for them to go to different planets and bring to them this newly evolved world order that they've created here in the United States, or one state, depending on the translation. D503 starts the narration as the great supporter of this new world order. He is quite happy with the way that the things are, and he's quite content with the society he lives in. He has a female number 090 and a friend R13 whom he almost considers family. Then one day he meets in I330 a female number who completely disrupts his orderly life. She seeks him out, arranges meetings, gets a pink ticket to get to see him, makes him skip work, which is a big no-no, and soon D503 understands that he's fallen in love with her in a very ancient way, as love is completely forbidden in this society. 090, who confesses her love for D503, she eventually lets him go be happy with I330, but first she asks him to impregnate her, which is an offense punishable by death, as she is considered to be defective. She's far too small to have children, but she really wants to have this baby and feel him kind of under her heart, and she wants this baby to be D503's, and he complies. On the yearly election of the well-doer or benefactor, where every number should raise their hands in unison in support of this well-doer, a number of people vote against him, including I330 in R13, and that's something that's never happened before. I330 turns out to be a revolutionary, part of the group called Mephi. She takes D503 outside of the Green Wall and shows him the savages who live there. Their plan, and that's why Mephi needed D503, is to steal the integral and turn it against the city. They even managed to sneak onto the integral on the first test flight, but the Guardians, they already knew about the plan, and so it fails. In order to stop this revolutionary movement that's brewing, the government announces a mandatory procedure that needs to happen to every number. The procedure is going to remove part of the brain that is responsible for imagination. At the same time, Mephi manages to destroy part of the green wall, kind of letting the world outside in, and that creates quite a chaos in the city. I-330, at D503's request, manages to sneak the pregnant O9T outside of the green wall into relative safety. D503's apartments get searched by the Guardians at the report of a female number U who seems to have some sort of feelings for him, and in a moment of anger he almost kills her but spares her. D503 then gets summoned by the benefactor or the well-doer, who tries to convince him that Mephi only needed him for the integral and that I-330 never loved him anyways, and D503 in turn is quite surprised to see that the benefactor is just an ordinary number, part of the machine just like he is. I-330 comes to D503 to see what the benefactor wanted from him, but then leaves. D503 then decides to confess everything to the Guardians, but as he tells everything to an S number who's been following him around this entire time, he understands that this S number is also part of Mephi and flees. He then gets captured and put through the mandatory procedure of the imagination removal. In the last chapter, he dispassionately watches as I-330 gets tortured for information in the gas chamber, and professors hope that their movement gets stopped and we win. Now, if you've read any other dystopias, you might find parts of this rather familiar, so let's establish some context. Evgeniy Zamyatin wrote his book We sometime between 1920 and 1922 in St. Petersburg. If you remember your Russian history, you would understand that it's already after the October Revolution in the newly established USSR. And as you can imagine, the book was not that well received in the Soviet Union. Not only did it receive the ban from the censor's office, it was also heavily criticized by the famous authors of that time, like Kornei Chukovsky and Maxim Gorky. It's also started a fall from grace for Zamyatin, who was already an established and famous author at the time. Following this book, he was kind of subtly but forcibly removed not only from the public eye but from the writers' circles, and that eventually led him to him leaving the Soviet Union altogether. The circumstances around that are kind of sus. You don't just leave USSR. But since we have no evidence that he was working for the Bolsheviks even in Europe, we're kind of gonna put it to the side here. Since the book couldn't have been published in USSR, it first saw light abroad. It was published in New York 1924, but in English, then in Russian 1952, and the first edition of the book in USSR was published only in 1988. When it comes to dystopias, researchers name quite a few that can be considered the first dystopias, starting with something like Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift or works by Herbert Wells, but we can somewhat agree that We by Zamyatin started a trend in dystopian fiction that would be followed by Brave New World, written in 1931, 1984, written in 1949, and Fahrenheit 451, written in 1953. So I'm not exaggerating when I'm saying that We was the dystopia that started it all. What is a dystopia then? A dystopia is a genre blossomed in the 20th century, likely spurred on by the atrocities that people saw in the Nazi regime and the Soviet Stalinism. Dystopia can be described as an antonym to utopia, a term coined by Thomas More in his most famous work of the same name, where he has strived to describe the ideal society. But in a catch-22 of it all, dystopias and utopias carry a lot of similarities in them, but just as many differences. Dystopias came back with a vengeance in the early 21st century, becoming especially popular in the YA genre, but the basic tropes, they remain the same. Dystopian fiction is most succinctly characterized by the control of the society by one or another entity. It often not only controls the political system of that society, but also the philosophical/religious beliefs, but also the technological, bureaucratic, and reproductive systems. It is generally set in an ambiguous future and can be believed to be a utopia by its residents, but some portion of the population understands it to be oppressive and it rebels. Tropes that you would often see are the loss of individual identity and the conformity in society, false utopia, total governmental control and constant surveillance, control over interpersonal relationships, bans on love, and control of the sexual behavior in specific, and rebellions, real or imaginary. Another thing that you would notice, and this for specifically, is not even the chosen one trope, which is very present in the YA dystopias. D503 and Winston, they're not the chosen one, but the government pays them special attention, and that allows them to act for far longer than would be expected in their society. I don't necessarily want to call it plot armor because it's not that, but they're special enough to warrant a conversation with a well-doer or somebody like his lordship, so they're exceptional. I want to take a look at We, but I also want to compare it to Brave New World in 1984 because they share a lot of similarities. Orwell didn't shy away from admitting that We inspired 1984. He was reading it at the same time as he was writing it. I'm not going to draw too many parallels with Fahrenheit 451. They stand quite separate in my mind and share fewer similarities, but we'll see. The fascinating thing to keep in mind is that Zamyatin was writing his book in the 1920s, way before the totalitarian state fully formed, so he was imagining what that society might look like, while Orwell or even Huxley, they had real-life examples to draw from. So in a way, Zamyatin predicted quite a few inventions of the 20th century. Zamyatin is also less interested in the world building. His entire focus is on the society and D503's feelings and transformation in specific. All the bits about the dome, the world outside, and even the integral they are mentioned in passing, they are all a background to D503's journey. The authors that followed, they spent much more time on the world building. That's probably one comparison that I can draw with Fahrenheit 451. Bradbury is also much more interested in Montag's character and journey and the world is that less defined than it is in 1984, A Brave New World. And the world in We is so sterile because Zamyatin at one point or another was sympathizing with the Bolshevik ideas. He was taking the ideal society as it was imagined by the communists, and that's probably why the characters within the story would consider it to be utopia. He was projecting and interpolating the ideas that he saw in the early 20th century, and that's why they're probably almost coded positively in a way. Because yes, there is total surveillance, yes, there is no freedom, but at the same time, nobody's hungry, everybody's working, everybody's having sex. So in a vacuum, it's pretty okay. If we look to Orwell, his society is much darker, with class disparity, food shortages, and war. And that's very much dictated by the time period and whom history has proven right. Zamyatin seemingly focuses on the technological progress, how mathematical and logical can overtake the world, and if left unchecked, it can destroy the person's individual identity and everything that makes us human. This is likely influenced by Zamyatin's own background. He was a maritime engineer. He spent years in England building icebreakers for the Russian Empire, and that's why D503 is the builder of the Integral, spaceship. Huxley focuses on the loss of the spiritual, how consumerism is going to not only make us stupid, but also susceptible to the very basic of instincts, how education and intelligence are going to become superfluous. Orwell, who's seen the horrors of World War II and Nazi regime, is afraid of the totalitarian state and war. And these fears are at the base of the worlds that they've created in their books. Zamyatin describes a society that is regulated to a T. They all march in unison, they chew in unison, they wear the same uniform. All of their days are regulated and kind of structured to an hour. And D503 finds happiness in the strictness and rigidity of his world. He praises the Guardians for taking care of him by watching him, because any deviations are not only forbidden by the law, but they are also a threat to his supposed happiness. D503 is not a revolutionary at the start. He's quite content with his world. He does not hate it. I-330 throws a wrench into his orderly life and forces him to join the revolution, while Winston in 1984, he hates the system, he seeks to destroy it, and he drags Julia along with him. In the same vein, it's an interesting opposition. In the one state, the rebellion is brewing. D503 encounters quite a few people who are part of MEFI, the revolutionary movement. Well, Winston is very much alone. In Oceania, rebellion is impossible. It is suffocated at the very start by the Big Brother. The system in the Brave New World stands separately, as it does not need to suppress a rebellion because it's not likely to happen, and if it ever does, they just force that person out of their system and lets them be. The society in Brave New World is built on pleasure and abundance. That's also why Brave New World does not have the total surveillance of We or 1984, nor does it have the tortures of executions of the Bell or the Ministry of Love. It does not need it. If you keep people content and happy, they will not need to rebel. This is achieved through excess pleasure, drugs, and sex, pretty much absent in We in 1984. And while the world of We can be viewed as somewhat neutral up until the terror act performed by Methy, Orwell took the ideas of the Bell and the transparent houses and turned them to the extreme. Big Brother is watching you. The Ministry of Love is also much more ruthless as it goes beyond what happened to D503, but achieving the same result. We presents the least hierarchical world out of all of three of them. This uniformity seemingly creates equality, while 1984 and Brave New World specifically have a very structured class system with very little chance of changing your status. Religion has been removed but been replaced with similar worship of the well-doer, his lordship, or the Big Brother. All three books constantly refer back to the society before, highlighting the positive changes that occurred. The past is constantly criticized and ridiculed for its primitivity and is straight up rewritten in 1984. In order to highlight this difference of this world to the world as we know it, We and 1984 use language tools, the newspeak or neologisms in general. Something like UNIF or IRA were introduced by Zamyatin to highlight this difference of the world. Interesting is the attitude of the society to love, families, and sex. 1984 presents the weakest position that has been criticized as unrealistic. While it makes sense that in a society that is built on hate, sex would be suppressed, but it probably wouldn't work. Families are also created for the simple purpose of procreation, but I do not remember the position of that society on children. Zamyatin and Huxley had a very similar idea. Family needs to be eradicated, the bond between the parents and children severed, that would allow you to build the people as you want them to be without any unwanted surprises and contingencies. Both worlds have embraced eugenics. The one state hence selects the best specimen out of their men and women, and only they are allowed to procreate, but they also don't get to keep their children. The children is raised by the state. Brave New World goes further and removes live birth altogether. The incubators allow them to build their people as they want them to be. These people do not have parents altogether. Words like father and mother are considered to be swear words. We and Brave New World have similar attitudes towards sex. They both embrace the total sexual freedom. Brave New World encourages orgies, while We is a little bit more structured with their pink ticket approach. And it ties to the love motif of all three books. All three protagonists, they go through the test of love and interestingly react in a very similar fashion. In a weird way, they all feel hatred towards the object of their obsession, arguably because their passion is so strong, this animalistic thing that they're not used to, but they all think about harming their women at one point or another, so that's not good. This plotline in Brave New World left me most uncomfortable, as John the Savage never gets to kind of embrace this part of himself, and he punishes himself and Linda brutally for it. D503 and Winston go from hating their women to passionately loving them, but obviously neither gets a happy ending out of it. D503 is also involved in a weird love geometrical shape, as he loves I330, but it's never clear if she reciprocates. 090 loves him, but he does not love her, and there's this U number who also has feelings for him. In a society where no love should exist, there are a lot of people with feelings. But if we wanted to sum it up, Neil Postman in his book Amusing Ourselves to Death, as depicted here in a comic form by Stuart Macmillan, put it as such. In short, Orwell feared that what we hate will ruin us. Huxley feared that what we love will ruin us. If we were to continue with this, Zamyatin feared that rationality or the absence of love and hate will ruin us. Now, we've talked about it comparatively to other dystopias. What sets it apart then? Have I got the point across that We was the first dystopia and that some of the ideas that we love in 1984, they actually came from Zamyatin? Okay. While Zamyatin has influenced many authors after him, he was also influenced by those who came before him. Some that we can cite are Nikolai Gogol, for example, the father of all Russian fantasy, but his Diaries of a Madman in specific that are structured as diary entries that progressively get less structured and coherent. And then there is somebody like Vladimir Mayakovsky, a famous Russian poet who is quite famous for the way that he builds his neologisms and his poetry. If you look at Zamyatin, he builds his sentences and his neologisms in a very similar fashion. He was likely influenced by Mayakovsky. The parallel that I didn't sketch myself is that with Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. Researchers also cite similarities with Brothers Karamazov, Demons, and Notes from Underground. There are passages in We that are quite similar to some ideas in those books, and Dostoevsky also criticizes the new ideas of socialism in those books. But the parallel in Crime and Punishment is most prominent, I guess. As D503 understands that he wants to kill you, the callbacks to the scene where Raskolnikov kills the old woman, they become quite obvious. The ever-present color yellow that signifies the delirious St. Petersburg in Dostoevsky's work finds its way into the transparent and grey world of We in The Boldness of a Neighbor, the staircase, the back of the head of the woman, the thoughts of D503 as to how and when he's going to confess. All of this kind of brings back the famous scene in Crime and Punishment. Zamyatin's style of writing is also interesting. It's rather dry, but it is consistent because these are the diary entries and it is kind of consistent with D503's character. He calls them records and each one is prefaced with an abstract, all but one. But as we progress into the book, the style changes along with D503. Zamyatin tries to portray this almost stream of consciousness of his protagonist with weird punctuation, like double dashes or multiple ellipses. There is also unintentional humor, like the fact that D503's favorite book is the official Railroad Guide. This rational mindset is also present in the metaphors that he uses. They're predominantly mathematical. Even poetry that he uses has to do with simple maths. An interesting transformation happens with the title of the novel, We. Initially, D503 uses We to describe this small society that lives in this unity of them all, which, as we understand, has to do with the loss of individual identity as well. But as we go through the book and he falls in love with I330, he starts referring to them, to the pair of them, as We. And then, in the end, We is once again the society and maybe the society at large. A brilliant idea by Zamyatin was also to remove names and replace them with numbers. It speaks to the loss of individual identity once again and fits the mathematical world quite perfectly, and quite unfortunately also found its way into the real world in concentration camps and gulags. One criticism of the book that I have is the constant callbacks to the world before. 1984 and Brave New World also has it. For me personally, not only is it done quite crudely, but it also makes me feel like Zamyatin doesn't trust his reader to understand the parallels that he's drawing, so he's forced to make these constant callbacks to the things that the reader is familiar with. But it also does not fit the narrative. D503 is ostensibly writing for the aliens that they're gonna encounter on the mission to the Martians and the Uranians, so what's the point of constantly referring back to things like Christianity or elections or other barbaric things that the Martians would have no context for? But the reader does. My point is that it took me out of the narrative and made me feel like Zamyatin doesn't think highly of me, that he constantly needs to clarify things for me, and I don't like it. Orwell also did that a little bit, but it made a little bit more sense there because those are Winston's memories that he needs to refresh for himself, for Julia, and for the reader. In conclusion, if you like dystopias like 1984 or Brave New World, it might be a curiosity for you to check out the one that started it all. It might not have the revolutionary ideas anymore as it's been followed by many others after it, but if you put it into a historical context, it becomes an interesting read, so do check it out.